Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name's Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today I'll be quilting my friendly sampler, and the first thing I needed to do was to clean up my sewing room. I've been doing some applique, and I also needed to switch out my sewing machine. I like to use my Juki when I do machine quilting. So after I got my machines all set up and my table cleaned off, I was able to begin. Here is my quilt top, the friendly sampler, and I'll leave a link below about that quilt. I did not have enough of one fabric for the backing of my quilt, so I had to make some decisions about how I was going to piece the back. Now I did have some leftover blocks from this project, so I tried laying those across the width of this quilt, and I think I'm going to use those. I'm going to add 2 little pieces of fabric on each side of that row, and then I had to piece another section for the top of the backing of this quilt. Tried to find some fabrics that were similar with the white background and a blue print, and this is what I came up with. So here is my quilt top underneath, and I don't measure. I usually just lay it on the floor and piece things together about 2 inches bigger than I need all the way around. Here's the backing after I pieced it together, and next thing I did was I opened a huge package that I received recently. I ordered some batting in the mail, and I ordered a whole bolt, so I needed to pull that out. I like to use, typically I use batting that is an 80-20 backing, 80% cotton and 20% polyester. So I pulled it out of the box, and then I cut off just enough for what I would need for the quilt that I'm working on. When batting comes like this, it is folded in half and rolled up in that bolt. So what I do is I spread it out, and then I lay my quilt on the batting before cutting, and I usually lay it the width, and when I open it up it will be plenty long for the length of my quilt top. So I laid the quilt down, and then I tried to give myself some room here, and I cut about 2 inches away from the edge of my quilt top. I took the front of the quilt and the batting and I took it to my table and I tried to smooth things out a little bit, and then I like to use a 505 spray. It's called a fabric adhesive, temporary adhesive, and I spray that on the batting and I smooth the quilt top right on top of the batting. So I start not exactly in the center, but towards the middle of the quilt, and I smooth from the middle out. Try to get the quilt top nice and smooth on the batting, and then I did the same with the backing. When my quilt sandwich was ready, I lowered my feed dogs and I got my quilting foot attached to my machine, and I took a little scrap of fabric and batting to do a little test with my stitches, and I also added some blue thread for the top of my quilt top. I needed to choose a color and I chose the blue. Since there are so many colors in this quilt, it was a little bit hard to decide. And I also am using white thread in the bottom. Now, if my tension was not right, having the two different colored threads would be a problem, but my tension seems to be really good right now. That's not always the case. If it wasn't correct, then I would have little pieces of white thread popping up or the blue thread down below. But right now, everything's good, so I was able to use two different color threads to match the fabrics on the top and the bottom. I started somewhere in the middle of this quilt. I'm starting with this basket block, and I'll fill in this block one block at a time, and I'm using a loop-de-loop type design, just a free motion design that curved lines with some loops, and it's kind of my go-to design when I'm quilting an all-over pattern. So after I was done with the basket block, I just moved on to the next quilt block, and I kept moving around my quilt using this pattern. When I got to the couple of squares, I think I have 3 blocks that are more of an applique design, like that one on the left that you can see right there. I did not do the loop-de-loop inside the applique. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to come back and work on those with another design. When I was all done quilting the quilt blocks in the center of my quilt, I started to work on the border with the same type of design. And again, I am not going to be quilting on top of my applique. I'm trying to kind of work around the applique, and I'm doing a little bit of sort of an echo to the designs on the applique. So here are some of the large applique designs that I did not quilt. This grandmother's flower garden design with the hexagons, and I have these really big flowers. So I'm going to go back and with my feed dogs down and my quilting foot here, I'm just going to again sort of echo the design inside, this time inside the flower, and then I'll go around those little circles in the center. After everything was quilted, I took it to my table and my cutting mat, and I'm going to cut that excess batting and backing away using the quilt top as my guide, and then all I need to do is add the binding to this beautiful quilt. I did not have enough of that solid pink. That would have been nice to go around my quilt, but I did have this print that's a really pretty, I think it's a reproduction fabric that is really beautiful. It's kind of hard to use those pretty fabrics for me sometimes because I will be using quite a bit of this pink to go around, but it really turned out to be a great option. So my strips are 2.5 inches, and I will join them together to make my long piece of binding, and I put the right sides together, and then I put a seam in corner to corner, and after I get all the ends sewn together, I will trim away the leftover triangles there. When my binding was all pressed in half, I sat down at my machine, and I'm going to be attaching it to the back of my quilt. I'll leave a little tail, maybe 10 inches. I'll put those raw edges sort of together there. I'll line the raw edges up, and then I'll begin sewing all the way around my quilt. When I approached a corner, I did not sew all the way to the corner. I like to stop a 1/4 inch away. I pivot, and then I sew off that corner so that there's a little tiny diagonal stitch there. I turn the quilt, I lift that binding up, and then I fold it down right there on that stitch, and then I will begin sewing right at the top of that fold, and I'll do that on all 4 corners of my quilt. and I got all the way around my quilt. I stopped before the end, so now I have 2 tails of binding, and I folded that one on the left, and this strip on the right I'm going to cut, and I want the fold to be right next to that place where I cut my fabric. And then I'll take the little piece of binding that I cut off, and I'll use that to measure. I need this piece on the left side to be 2.5 inches long, and it's handy to use that little piece that I cut off since my binding is 2.5 inches. Then I put the right sides together, sort of at an angle like I did when I was putting all the strips together. And you kind of need to bunch up your quilt to be able to manage this. I put a little pin there, and then I sewed across from corner to corner. And before I cut off that triangle, I double checked to make sure that this was fitting correctly on my quilt. After double checking that it did fit correctly, I just finished sewing that last bit of binding onto the back of my quilt. And next thing I'm going to do, the last thing I need to do, is to roll that binding to the front, and then I'm going to top stitch all the way around this quilt. And here is the friendly sampler all ready to go. This quilt began with about 5 quilt blocks from a quilting friend of mine who gave them to me. I think they had been sitting in a box for quite a while. And then here in my sewing room on this channel, we've been working on this sampler quilt. We ended up with 20 quilt blocks. I added a fun border with some applique, and this quilt is going back to that original quilter for her granddaughter. I'm really happy it found a home so soon after finishing it, and I look forward to many more sewing adventures with you. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.